Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on international economics. My name is Nora Aboushady. I'm from the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, and I will be the chair of this session. We have three very interesting presentations today. The first one is on how to make trade policy innovation friendly and what is the role of trade agreements, which is prepared and presented by my colleagues Yasmine Eissa and Chahir Zaki. So Yasmine, you have 15 minutes for the presentation, and then we will follow by the discussion before moving to the next paper. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nora, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the session today. We are presenting our recent work on the effect of trade agreements and the provisions in the regional trade agreements on the innovation performance at the country level. This work is with my co-author, Chahir Zaki, and it is motivated from our previous work where we were estimating the effect of GBC participation and the knowledge spillovers through GBC participation on the innovation performance. And now we are extending this study by examining whether the trade agreements also play a role in fostering innovation performance at the country level or not. So the motivation behind our work is coming from the fact that more than 90% of the patents globally are concentrated in high-income countries. Not only all the high-income countries, but they are concentrated in like 5 or 6 high-income countries. And we have examples, successful examples, like China, for example, that was able to foster its patents and innovation performance. And this is going in parallel with its increased spending in the R&D. So it has a share of spending of 2.5% of the GDP, which is higher than the average of the world, which is 1.7. And on the other hand, we have countries in Africa that have slowly and stagnant innovation growth, and the average in Africa of the R&D spending is 0.4. So it's below the average worldwide. The provisions in the trade agreements are increasing with the increase of the number of trade agreements. And the provisions are extending beyond the trade dimension. So we have non-economic gains of the provisions, and amongst these gains are environmental provisions, labor standards, and also innovation and the progress of the technology. And the number of the provisions are increasing, and we have different types of the provisions. So we have a type of provisions that is trade-related, which is named the WTO plus provisions. And these are the type of provisions that are strengthening the mandate of the WTO. And on the other hand, we have the WTO extra provisions, and these are provisions that are going beyond the mandate of the WTO. So the environmental regulations, for example, innovation policies that is beyond the TRIPS agreement would be included in the extra provisions rather than the plus provisions. And we have different channels where the innovation performance can be fostered. So the first direct channel of trade is by reducing the trade barriers and by higher integration through the scale effect of international trade is expected to directly foster innovation performance. And this can be also enhanced with the foreign knowledge spillovers through the GVC or the foreign direct investment, and also the institutional alignment. However, we have two effects that can happen. So as I just mentioned, we can have a trade-led innovation progress, and we have a lot of papers on the learning by exporting, and also the import channel that carries the knowledge from the foreign countries would foster innovation, adding to that the GVC participation and the foreign direct investment, and again the institutional alignment that can enhance the competition policy, the innovation policy, and the cooperation and the collaboration across countries. On the other hand, these provisions and the trade agreements are not coming for free. They have compliance costs. And as the number of the provisions are increasing, we can have overlapping effect of these provisions. So it may be difficult to track whether the provision is really having the impact or not. We can have the spaghetti ball effect where, as I just said, the overlapping of the different provisions, maybe they are targeting the same output, okay, and we might find misleading results in this case. So in this paper, we are assessing whether the provisions and the regional trade agreements are compatible with the determinants of the innovation performance or not. We are studying the heterogeneity across the income level. And of course, our findings are related to the Sustainable Development Goal number 9, aiming for fostering innovation and infrastructure. We are doing that by merging the regional trade agreements data set of the World Bank with the innovation measures and the determinants of innovation from the World Development Indicators. Again, we are differentiating between the two types of provision, the WTO plus versus the WTO extra provisions. And we are differentiating between the breadth measure and the depth measure, which is the intensity of the provisions within the categories. In summary, what we find is that the WTO plus matters for innovation performance. And this is opposed to the WTO extra provisions that we can see that the effect is silent on innovation performance. The depth of the provisions matters more than the breadth, and the effect is more pronounced for the low-income countries and the lower middle-income countries. The rest of the presentation is going as follows. We will be showing some data representation and graphical analysis, followed by the methodology, and then the empirical results, and finally the conclusion. So this is here showing us the trend of the increase of the number of regional trade agreements over time, starting in 1955, and we can see that the slope is higher, like all the trade integration measures, like the GVC. We can see that starting in the 90s, we have an increased slope, and the number of signed agreements are reaching 400 and something in the year 2024. This graph is showing how the trend of the innovation is now not really determined only by the GDP per capita. So we can see that before 2010, the GDP per capita is moving hand in hand with the patents innovation measure. However, we have a surge in the patents afterwards, and the slope of the GDP per capita is still flat, which is showing that we have other measures other than the welfare now to include for the determinants of innovation, whether it is the international interlinkage that is happening or other measures that is related to the quasi-institutions that we need to explore. One of the important stylized facts, again, for the innovation is that it is concentrated, again, in the higher income countries, and we can see the dispersion of the patents across the different income groups. This graph here is averaging the patents from the year 1990 until 2019. Again, the categories of the WTO plus areas that are related to trade and are strengthening the mandate of the WTO is divided into three main categories: the non-tariff measures, services, and institutions. And we can see here the share of each category within the within the measure. So these are the categories of the NTMs and the share of each category within the non-tariff measures, okay, and then the services and the institutions. The policy areas for both the WTO plus and the WTO extra are 52, and we can see that the policy areas and the extra provisions are more than the WTO plus provisions. And in the extra provisions, the categories are divided to institutions, political, economic, and social institutions. This is the trend of the breadth or the number of the categories of the provisions over time of the WTO extra provisions versus the plus provisions, and this is the overall measure of the WTO provisions. However, when we see the depth, we can see that the variability of the WTO plus provisions is clear compared to the WTO extra provisions. And at the country level, we can see that the intensity of the provisions is higher in Europe. This is the all of the provisions measure, extra plus the WTO plus. And the WTO plus is concentrated more in North America and some European countries, while the WTO extra, we can see that the highest intensity, which is the lightest color, is also concentrated in Europe. Moving to the methodology and the variables of interest, the econometric specification is defined as follows. The dependent variable is the resident patents per capita in logarithm. And the main independent variable is the provisions, and the provisions variable is divided into the WTOX and the WTO plus and the overall provisions. And each of them is divided into a breadth measure and a depth measure. And then we have the classic independent variables, the control variables. The main independent variable for the innovation progress is the domestic R&D stock. And the GDP per capita is included in order to control for the level of the development of the country, the population controls for the size of the country. We are here including tariffs in order to exclude the shallow effect of trade agreement. So what we are capturing is only the provisions effect, okay, when we exclude already the shallow agreement, which is the tariffs. We are here including the variable that we have measured in our previous work, which is the knowledge spillover through the GVC participation. And we are including also the share of the oil experts in the total manufactured exports in order to control for the oil dependence. So in our further analysis, we are studying specific groups of the provisions. So rather than studying the WTO plus, we are also studying the NTMs versus the services and the institutions. And we are studying the heterogeneity again across the income groups. And we are using alternative measures for the innovation rather than the patent per capita. And this measure is the weighted knowledge through the total inputs. We have an indigeneity concern because maybe we have a positive effect, but maybe also the countries that are in the lightest area of the map that we have seen are the high-income countries, and they are already self-selected in the provisions. So we need to control for this indigeneity or the reverse causality concern, and this will be done in a previous in a coming work. For the empirical results, we find that the WTO plus provisions foster innovation, and the depth of the provisions matters more than the breadth. We'll see now the tables showing the results. For the extra provisions, we do not witness a pronounced effect on the patent per capita. And also, the optimistic result is that we find that the low-income countries and the middle-low-income countries are the main beneficiaries from these provisions in the regional trade agreements. As we can see in the baseline results, we can see that the WTO plus is having the only positive effect is shown in the WTO plus provisions, and the main control variables have the expected positive effect. And we can interpret this by saying that if the WTO plus provision increased by 1 unit, the patent per capita would increase by 0.72%. While for the depth measure, we can see a higher effect. So we have a 10.2% increase in the patent per capita with the increase of the intensity or the depth measure. As I mentioned, we are also classifying the categories in order to know which category matters for the innovation performance. And we can see that although the 3 categories of the WTO plus are significant, the significance is lower for the services. So the main categories that foster innovation are the NTMs and the institutions within the WTO plus provisions. We are here including some of the non-trade related or some of the WTO extra provisions because we can witness that we don't have a positive or a significant effect of WTO extra. So we want to know whether the specific provisions are relevant or not. And we have some confusing result or unexpected result. So the investment, for example, is showing a negative effect, which is not expected. However, maybe this is because of the type of the investment. Maybe the investment is more into real estate or more into sectors that are not directly related to foster innovation. When we classify the income groups, we can see that, again, the lower, middle, and the low income countries are the significant, have the significant effect, and therefore they are the main beneficiaries from these provisions. And we can also see that for when we when we add the extra and the plus provisions together, the low-income countries show a positive and significant effect. As a robustness check, okay, we are using, again, another measure for innovation, which is the weighted knowledge in the total inputs. And we can see that the results are consistent. So again, the WTO plus is showing the significant effect, and the categories are also significant, and the services are now showing a higher significance. But they're consistent because, again, we see that the extra and the overall measure are not significant. So as a conclusion, until now, in the version of the paper that we are presenting today, we show that the provisions matter for fostering innovation, but the type of the provisions differ. So the provisions that matter are the WTO plus, which are the provisions that are related to trade and strengthen the mandate, the mandate of the WTO. And the categories of the non-tariff measures and the institutions matter the most. The lower middle income and the low income countries are particularly benefiting from engaging in trade agreements. And what we need to do in our coming work is to study the concern of indigeneity. And we can also examine which channels matter more. Is it the GVC channel or the foreign direct investment that matter more to innovation? And until now, what we have as policy implication is that we need to put the NTMs and the institutions as a priority when negotiating or discussing the trade agreements. We might be, after we see that some types of innovation provisions are not significant, then we call for maybe a better implementation of the intellectual property rights. And of course, enforcing competition and the innovation policies are always recommended in order to provide a healthy and innovation-friendly ecosystem. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to Nora's comments.
Thank you very much, Yasmine, for this very interesting presentation. I will share my comments. So thank you very much, Yasmine and Chahir, for this very interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it a lot. It flows very easily, and you really enjoy the paper, even if you're not an innovation expert. So to summarize, the paper explores the impact of regional trade agreements and on the depth and coverage of provisions in regional trade agreements on innovation, with a focus also on developing countries and on lower income countries, which is a very important aspect. It shows that WTO plus provisions at this point matter more than WTO-X, which also makes us think about the actual context where the role of the WTO and the role of multilateralism is actually declining in favor of growing bilateral or like agreements outside of the scope of the WTO. However, those rules under the WTO appear to matter more for innovation. I have some very minor comments and some clarification questions, since I'm not an expert in patents and in innovation, and maybe for people who are not also familiar with the topic and would like to read the paper, they may need some more clarifications on some aspects. So I checked actually the website for the resident patents, and I was wondering if you also include other variables like industrial design applications and other intellectual property rights, and if this makes sense at all. Again, I'm not an expert in the topic, but this is just a suggestion. And if there is also a disaggregation for those innovation indicators, like by sector, for example, in industry, in services, in, I don't know, academic publications, for example. I've seen something like that on the World Bank, yes. So, on the World Bank website. So maybe it's important to see also what type of innovation do we have here and in which sectors, and also try to link that with the countries that innovate. Would the regional dimension add to the analysis? I'm not sure, but I would like to see, for example, how Africa is doing in terms of, like, graphically in a map. And I think you've presented that here, so but I think it was missing from the paper that you've provided. And as we've discussed before, so the term breadth, I was a bit confused by breadth and horizontal coverage, because when the provisions are included or when they are measured as the share of provisions included to the maximum number possible, we call that horizontal depth. While in my next slide, I would suggest, of course, that you consider the vertical depth, which is the legal enforcement and the availability of dispute settlement mechanisms for the provisions, because there is a growing body of literature on that. It's not a very well-established literature at the moment, especially when linking it to innovation. So it would add a lot to the paper to include the vertical dimension, because from previous work on other outcome variables, we know that although that the provisions are actually horizontally covered in the agreement, they are not effective when, or they do not have really a significant impact when they are not legally enforced. So it would add really a very interesting dimension to the paper. And for the controls, I know that this is a draft, but in your next draft, you may want to ground the choice of variables in the literature a bit more. Especially, for example, for the oil dependency, who's done that before, why does it matter, and why would it have a counterproductive effect on innovation? You need to see some literature on that. And I didn't understand your measure of spillover effects from GVCs. So what is the foreign innovation input? How do you measure it? Especially that this is one of your previous work, so it's worth investing a bit more in explaining what this is. And for the indigeneity, I would suggest you may want to use, because Chahir and I, we were working on a similar paper and also with an indigeneity problem. And you may want to measure the distance in the political regimes between each of the countries and its main trade partner as an alternative measure also to the quality of the institutions. I mean, if the one doesn't work, the other may work. So this is just a suggestion. And in very minor comments in the appendix, you may want to put the table where you explain the different provisions, what these are. First, for the reader to understand what these provisions are before they look at the shares in the agreements. And please clarify the percentages that you depict in the appendix in both figures, if they are the share of each provision in the category, like theoretically, given the maximum number of provisions that is possible under this category, or that are actually included in the provisions, in the agreements in place. I wasn't sure about that. So just very minor clarification comments for the reader. Thank you very much. I enjoyed reading the paper a lot.
Thank you.
And we can, thank you. And we can move now to the second paper.
Some questions and respond, or later?
I'm not really sure. Should we move to the next? Maybe it's worth like 5 minutes of an open discussion first, if anyone has questions and comments, and then we can move to the presentation, so that we don't forget if the questions. Please go ahead, Dr. Shah.
Thank you very much, Yasmine, for your interesting presentation. I just have a question. You used the research and
The R&D.
R&D stock, and I saw you mentioned it's personnel.
Yes, it's the number of people working in
And
the
why
R&D.
didn't you use percent of R&D as a percent of
flow,
GDP?
As a flow measure?
Yes.
We chose the stock measure as a determinant, but of course we can also try the expenditure, the flow measure.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Abeer.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Abeer, for your comments. All your comments, Nora, are really, very helpful and to the point. I agree that it's important to consider the different alternative measures like the industrial applications. We haven't searched for that, but it's worth investigating, and also by sector to see whether perhaps innovation in the industrial sector might matter compared to other sectors. The regional dimension, we haven't thought about that, but it's also important because I think that at least Asia will perform better compared to other emerging economies. To have this distinction between the extensive and the intensive measures of the provisions, in the sense that to harmonize the name of the agreements that we're using, breadth versus horizontal. This also we have to clarify in the paper. For the choice of the variable, the control variables, I totally agree with you. The endogeneity for the instrument, I think yes, we might do this for the similarity in the political regime or the institutions. And finally, for the spillovers of GVC, it's the weighted it's the weighted R&D by the share of imports coming from the trade partner, in the sense that if I import a lot, let's say from the US compared to China, and the US is innovating more than China, this means that the technology embedded in imports will be higher. So that's why it's a spillover. So I don't know if Yasmine, you want to add something?
Thank you very much, Nora, for your very useful comments. I think Chahir responded to all, and I totally agree that we need to explore the vertical depth, and maybe we need to clarify the oil dependence and why it has a negative effect on innovation, and of course also the measure that we use, the GVC-RZ, or the knowledge spillover effect. So thank you, Nora. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much. Anyone else in the room has any questions or comments on this paper before we move to the next one? Okay. So now our second presentation is about the adjustment strategies and the costs of adjustment to trade liberalization, providing firm-level evidence from Egypt, presented by Dr. Abeer Elshennawy and Dr. Mohammed Bouaddi. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. The paper is about adjustment strategies and cost of adjustment to trade liberalization, firm-level evidence from Egypt. Now, Egypt trade regime witnessed significant changes since the early 90s as the country went through structural adjustment and stabilization programs, and as a result of this, tariffs fell. And then when the country joined country's accession to the World Trade Organization in 1995, followed by the signing of preferential trade agreement with the EU, Egypt's main trading partner, also tariffs and non-tariff barriers fell. The most important salient feature of this trade reform is that it was gradual in nature. Non-tariff barriers were phased out first, followed by tariffs gradually falling. And this was most evident in the case of liberalization within the EU agreement, according to which tariffs on input originating in the EU were gradually phased out over a transitional period of 12 years. So the salient feature of this reform is that it was gradual in nature. Within the EU agreement, tariffs on intermediate and capital goods were first eliminated, followed by tariffs on final goods. Now, it's widely documented in country experience that the main purpose of gradual trade reform, is to provide breathing space for firms to adjust to trade liberalization. And in general, this is shown to result in lower adjustment costs. Now, adjustment costs to trade liberalization are basically manifested in falling output, falling employment, and balance of payment problems. Now, when these adjustment costs are high, it often leads to reversal of trade reform. So the size of adjustment costs is very important for the sustainability of trade reform. The trade reform continues to materialize. Now, the empirical literature addressing both issue of adjustment strategies and adjustment costs to trade liberalization is in general scant, particularly for developing countries, among which in Egypt, with few exceptions, most existing studies are qualitative in nature, and only few tackle this issue using firm-level data, and hence lies our contribution. So against this background, the present paper seeks to explore the nature of adjustment costs to trade liberalization. We want to look at how did firms adjust to competition from imports. Did they contract in terms of output? Did they contract in terms of employment. So the main questions, and of course this is, we want to see adjustment strategies pursued by firms in Egypt's manufacturing sector. The main questions is how did firms adjust to competition from imports? Did they contract by reducing output or employment? What firm characteristics make them vulnerable to competition from imports? And how did adjustment to input competition differ between formal and informal firms, private versus public firms, and small versus large firms? We will attempt to answer these questions using firm-level data from Egypt Economic Census for the years 2012, 2013, 2017, 2018, which are the 2 years available. Before that, the data is not digital, and after that, we still don't have data. Now, the literature review shows that in general, especially in the case of developed countries, competition from import led to contraction in both output and employment. And also there's even evidence from China that trade liberalization affected firm output and productivity. So the findings that the fall in foreign and Chinese tariffs on final goods exert the strongest effect on firm level output, and tariffs lead to job destruction in low productivity firms and job creation in high productivity firms. In California, there's also evidence that declining tariffs led to reduction in employment and output, and in the case of the US, the same results. For some developing countries like Uruguay, for example, we find that trade liberalization was associated with large net job destruction at the firm level in the manufacturing sector. And in South Africa, Chinese input penetration affected employment in several manufacturing industries. So the bulk of the results show that trade liberalization had adverse effects on output or employment, either in developed or developing countries. So it's interesting to see what is the case in Egypt. So as I mentioned before, apart from these few studies, there isn't enough empirical evidence on firm adjustment to trade liberalization. Now, our methodology is we use quantile regression, and our main dependent variable for the 2013 and for the 2017-18 census is log output and log employment. I will present first the results for 2012-2013, and then I will move to 2017-2018. So the independent variables that we use, skill intensity, this is for log output, log capital, log labor, age of the firm, foreign ownership, whether the firm is owned by, is foreignly owned or not, whether the dummy variable, whether the firm imports or not, and whether the firm is formal or not formal, and sector, whether it's private or public. And then we have the variable of interest, which is input penetration, and whether the firm exports or not. So this is the main regression. We also run this regression with interaction terms between input penetration and most of these variables here, like skill intensity, age, input, location, formality, sector, export, and so on, to see what firm characteristics make it vulnerable to competition from inputs. Now, for the results for input penetration in the case of output, we find that input penetration was associated with higher output for firms in the first quintile. We have 3 quintiles, 10%, the median, and 90%. And as you can see here, input penetration was associated with higher output for the top for the lower 10 quintile, and for the other quintiles, for the median quintile, it's insignificant, and then for the upper quintile, it is negative, but not highly significant, and it's only so when we use the interaction terms. Now, if we know that the bulk of firms in Egypt are small firms, then we can say that in 2012-2013, input penetration was not associated with a reduction in output. On the contrary, with an increase in output for most of the firms. Now, if we move to, and then if we look at the interaction terms, most of them are not significant, but we can see here, for example, that location is positive. So firms located in Cairo and Alexandria experience higher output due to input penetration. And the reason for this puzzling result is that input penetration includes also imports of intermediate goods. And when you import intermediate goods, this makes you more competitive, and it can help you increase output. Now, if you look at the regression for log employment, we can see that input penetration is insignificant along all the quintiles, showing that input penetration did not lead firms to reduce employment, and this is along all three quintiles. So, in general, we can conclude that in 2012-2013, input penetration was not associated with contraction in output or in employment across firms. Now, for the 2017-2018, if we look at input penetration again, we find that firms in the 10th quintile experience reduction in output. This is opposite to the case of 2012-2013, and the median also experienced increase in output, and the 90th percentile also experienced increase in output. So we have, in terms of the 10th quintile, we have the opposite results of 2012-2013. And here we can say that input penetration had a negative effect, maybe because small firms cannot exploit economies of scale, and therefore because they are small in size, and therefore this can render them difficult to compete with imports. Now, in the case of employment, we find that input penetration was associated with higher employment for the 10th quintile and for the median quintile, but and also for the 90th quintile. So again, input penetration was not associated with reduction in employment. So the conclusion, what we can deduce from all this is that there is no compelling evidence at all that input penetration and hence trade liberalization over these two periods led to high adjustment costs. So Egypt's experience with trade liberalization over these 2 years is basically one with almost no adjustment cost to trade liberalization. And we want to look at why this might be the case. Now, one main reason is because trade liberalization was gradual in nature, and this provided firms with breathing space to adjust, and therefore adjustment costs were not very high. The second reason is that these two periods of the two census coincided with a very large devaluation of the Egyptian pound. And devaluation basically makes imports expensive and therefore can help firms withstand competition from imports. So these are the two reasons that we think are mainly behind why there was no high adjustment cost to trade liberalization. Now, conclusion, policy implication, the main result is that trade liberalization over these 2 years was not associated with high adjustment costs, and this provides lessons for other developing countries that wish to liberalize trade, that gradual nature of trade reform is conducive to lower adjustment costs, and that taking advantage of periods of devaluation eases adjustment on firms and also help reduce adjustment costs to trade liberalization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Abeer. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. The topic of the paper is actually very timely because there has been also a long-standing debate about the impact of liberalization on firms' performance. And although liberalization has basically started almost 30 years ago, but the policy debate on liberalization is still, of course, going on. So the paper, just to summarize for the audience, the paper explores the impact of trade liberalization on firm performance in terms of output and employment. And it considers firm-level characteristics such as formality, ownership, age, and size, and relies on the Egyptian economic census for 2 rounds. And it concludes that trade liberalization and import competition from the outside did not have negative effects on firm-level performance in terms of the 2 outcomes that are being measured. I think the paper fills an important gap in the literature because you can never get enough of firms' performance in the global economy. This is a topic that has been well established in the literature, but the academic contributions are still ongoing, and trade economists keep actually working on this topic, especially for a developing country like Egypt, given the economic conditions and given the fact that we are an open economy. We do depend on international trade and on global economic relations for our economic outcomes, and that you also focus on firm-level analysis, which is important because since the new trade theory has been established, we recognize the importance of firm-level characteristics and differences in firm-level characteristics in international trades. I have some comments and suggestions because I understand, of course, that this is a first draft, so you may want to work more to publish this paper. So it would add a lot to the paper if you develop a conceptual framework. In the literature review that you have provided, you listed several channels, but sometimes there is some overlapping between the channels, so you may want to visually present a graph, like a figure, where you illustrate the different channels through which trade liberalization, both from import competition and imports of inputs, can have an effect on firms, because it's a contradictory effect. On the one hand, if you import inputs, you raise productivity and you can perform better. On the other hand, if trade liberalization is in final goods, there will be import competition and the effect is unknown. Some firms may exit the market because they are not productive, and some other firms may increase their productivity, innovate, and respond to competition, and be able not only to respond to competition in the domestic market, but also export, so enter the global market. And this is exactly what the new trade theory, or the theory on heterogeneous firms and international trade, postulates. So you may want to invest some time in looking at this theoretical framework, because also the variables that you use in your econometric specifications are all extracted from the new trade theory. So it will add a lot to the paper that you mentioned, that you contribute to this theoretical framework by working on this case. And yes. The most important comment maybe for this paper is that the empirical specification is missing. It's hard to find. I don't see this line where you mention this is the dependent variable and these are the independent variables, and why you choose these variables, and what has been said in the literature about these variables and why they matter, and what is the expected effect. You mentioned that in a table, but it's also more maybe reader friendly to see that in the form of a text, while you can put, this is a very minor comment of course, but you can put the table in an annex. And here you can, as I mentioned before, benefit from the literature on firm heterogeneity in international trade. I have 2 questions, and maybe we can respond to that in the larger round. For 2 variables. The capital intensity is the capital to labor ratio, and your outcome variable or your dependent variable is employment, log employment. So you have labor in the independent variable and labor in the dependent variable. So I'm not sure if this variable can be included in the specification. The second one is the skill intensity, the share of skilled to unskilled labor. And in the literature on international trade and firms in international trade, this tends to be more of a dependent variable, an outcome variable. So there is a lot of papers about the impact of trade liberalization on skill intensity. So you also may want to consider excluding this variable from the regression or putting it as one of the independent variables. For example, if you want to extend your analysis beyond the impact of employment, you can also examine the impact on the employment of skilled or unskilled labor. So this could go to the other side. The import penetration ratio is also a bit problematic. I understand that tariffs, while tariffs have been liberalized, of course, non-tariff measures were on the rise, and this is why tariffs only are not enough in this case. But this is also an outcome variable because imports depend on the trade barriers, on the trade policy in place. So you may want to check the reference that I've suggested. You may want to add the tariffs and also the non-tariff measure data on the right-hand side of the regression, and in that case, you will avoid the fact that you have imports on the right-hand side, while at the same time you would be accounting for the impact of trade policy on import penetration, but without having the imports. I was wondering why you have separated between the 2 waves of the census, why you could have pooled actually the data and used sector and year fixed effects. Have you tried doing that? How were the results? So I mean, it's not very common that you see 2 regressions for 2 different waves. You could pool the data and run the regressions with sector and year fixed effects. Maybe you could get better results. And the interactions, the regression is huge. I understand that you want, of course, to see how different firm characteristics affect the outcome. But at the same time, I think you might reconsider your selection of interaction terms and focus on the main interactions, because we cannot have like 5 or 6 interactions in the same regression. I'm afraid it's too huge, and I'm not sure if it's necessary to keep all of them. Firm size is definitely important, so you could either interact it or maybe run 2 different regressions by firm size, like for small and medium firms and for large firms, and see which ones are more affected by, or if trade liberalization and import penetration matters for firms depending on their size, while you could keep the interaction terms that include the exporting and importing status of the firms. Because if the firm is importing and there's trade liberalization, the impact may be positive if the firm is importing inputs and these inputs are liberalized. While for exporting firms, probably competition from the outside will have an impact. Either they exit the market, that has a negative effect, or it increases also, it encourages them to be more productive and also export more. So maybe, and if you link that to my suggestions on the theoretical literature, when you highlight the different channels to which trade policy can affect firm level performance, you will be able to apply that in the regression. So this is just my suggestion, but we can discuss this as well on how to account for all of the firm level characteristics, but by reducing the size of the regression and the interactions a little bit. So my very minor comments, the first table, as I suggested, can go to the annex while you invest more time and like more text in explaining the theoretical foundation and the empirical specification in the main text. And just a small remark. Labor, I thought, I wasn't sure what labor really meant, but then I read the definition, and usually it's more conventional to use firm size instead of labor, to label just the variable. Because at the end, I think the labor variable is your measure of firm size. So a certain number of workers imply a small firm and so on. So just change the label of the variable to a firm size, it would be more reader-friendly. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think we can open the floor for a few comments, and then maybe if you want to respond to the comments as well.
Thank you very much for this interesting subject about Egypt. I would like to make a comment about the inclusion of interactive variables in this. I didn't see the table because it's too small. So, did you put all the interactive variables on the same regression or separately? Because, you know, interactive variables is the product of two variables that already in the regression. So this may be lead to serious multicollinearity problem. This will inflate the coefficient, both the coefficient to the student and the quality of adjustment to the R square. So what I suggest for robustness check, it's to create a composite index through PCA or something like that, or at least graphically include this interactive variables to make the visualization or something like that. Because if with the dummy variables, maybe the problem should be treated. Maybe it's hard to. I don't know if you test. You made the test the VIF or something like that to see the index of multicollinearity. Because I don't know. But for me, the best thing is to do a composite index or the average or something like that. That include the information that already in the interactive variables, and you earn in time, you save degree of freedom also. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Abeer and Mohammed, for the presentation. I have some suggestions as well. I think the paper is more about the firm performance rather than the adjustment cost, in the sense that you're examining the impact of liberalization on two performance variable, which is the firm size and its output. So, because when you motivated the paper in the beginning, I thought that you'll be talking about sector reallocation or layoffs, but in order to be able to measure layoffs, I think you need a panel, because you need to observe whether the firm had really layoffs with the trade liberalization or not. And this is not possible with the census data, given that you don't have a panel dimension. So I think it's better to motivate the paper from the perspective of the firm performance rather than the adjustment cost, in the sense that there is no sector reallocation, there is no really layoffs because of the data shortcoming. And a second comment, I totally agree with Nora on pooling the data, because this will help you have more variability, especially that when we use this paper that Nora mentioned for input liberalization, we found positive effect of input liberalization on TFP. But one of the main drawbacks of the economic census is that the share of exporting and importing firms is very small, because already the share of firms operating in the manufacturing sector is much smaller compared to those that are in services. So we end up, as far as I remember, having around 1,000 firms that are importing and around 600 that are exporting. So pooling the data perhaps will help you have more variability, and therefore the results will definitely improve. So and you can do this by including the sector fixed effects and year fixed effects. One final comment, it's a question more. Why is the quantile regression framework the relevant framework? I mean, the relevant estimation method. Is it because, I mean, we have an assumption that the largest firm will be able to face competition more, or because this can be already captured through the interaction variable of the size with tariffs, for instance, or with the import penetration measure? And that's why perhaps it can be better to start the analysis with normal OLS or high dimension fixed effect, something like this, and explore first whether the interaction variable with size matters, and if it matters, then we move to the quantile regression to show that really the top quantile, the 90th or the first percentile of the regression, the top, sorry, not the first, the top one, they are the most, or the least affected or the most affected by liberalization. Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments or suggestions? Yes.
suggest, since you are using the quantile, maybe perhaps in the literature you position the paper that is looking at the heterogeneity across the quantile or across the distribution. Rather, when you contrast yourself to the literature as a new contribution,
Yes.
maybe you will take it a bit in a different direction. So, since you already use the quantile.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you very much. Over to you, maybe if you want to
Dr.
respond
Mohammed
to any comments.
Will reply to the econometrics comment.
Thank you. So for the problem of multicollinearity, we use two tests, the rank test, and we find that the design matrix has 4 rank, and we do another test, which is the conditional number, the maximum eigenvalue over smallest eigenvalue. Because if the matrix, if we have multicollinearity, so the design matrix is near singular. This is the problem. So the smallest eigenvalue will be almost 0, because determinant in this case is near 0. So we did the test of whether.
You calculate the determinant of the matrix to see if it's.
No, I computed the eigenvalues, the smallest and the highest.
Okay.
And this because if the design matrix is singular, the smallest eigenvalue is near 0.
Yeah.
So when you do highest over smallest, you get a very big number. So we have a number less than 10, which suggests that there is no problem. And the rank is for rank. We did the test for rank test. Okay, so any other questions? So for the quantile, so for the quantile is not linked to the size of the company, is linked to the dependent variable. So the quantile is used.
Which is employment.
Yes.
Yes, so it's the size.
In somehow it's size. Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah. So, but the quantile, compared to the OLS is an average effect. So an average effect. But the quantile captures many things: nonlinearity and heterogeneity in the distribution. So because the OLS assume that the mean is constant, so the distribution is constant, is not changing in time. The mean and standard deviation are constant. The quantile is a way to go over the whole distribution. And if distribution is not constant, it moves, is dynamic, so we cover the whole distribution instead of just the average. So the average effect might be non-significant. When you run OLS, you may find that the average effect is not significant for some variables. But when you do a quantile, you might find that some variables are significant for low quantile and significant on the opposite sign in the higher quantile. So this is what quantile can cover.
Did you test the local coefficients of every enterprise there?
What coefficient?
Because in OLS it's the average.
Yeah.
So you can make test for every field. It's a specific coefficient in the regression to see if there is a huge variation or not, or is it a problem of heterogeneity, or maybe this add information about the size of fields as well.
You mean the coefficient, to estimate coefficients?
Yeah, because in OLS you
Okay. We didn't test. I think.
Just know.
Yeah. We can do it. We can do it.
60 mg you can.
Yeah. We can do it.
And to have get, or maybe also you can use the GWR to take account of the space and the heterogeneity of the firms, because in OLS we by hypothesis every unit or observational unit is independent from each other. And I think there is a lot of externality and spillovers between the firms.
Yeah.
So I think GWR, because it takes account of the neighbors, neighbors' firms or something like that, the interaction between firms instead of using interaction variables. So it can give you a lot of information about local, and you can use also the model to see if there is some autocorrelation between the firms to add value added to one.
Yeah, thank you. This is very information. Thank you.
Thank you. you very much. We now move to our final paper in this session on the impact of expectations and uncertainty on exports dynamics in Turkey. Nazire, you are going to present. Yes, you have 15 minutes. I think you mentioned no, it's for the report. It's not for the
much. So today I'm the presenter, Nergiz, Dincer, and this is a joint paper with Yeliz, Yalcin. She's my co-author and she's here as well, and Cengiz, Arikan. So the title of our paper is The Impact of Expectations and Uncertainty on Export Dynamics. So evidence from Türkiye. So after two Egyptian economy papers, I think this would be a different aspect for you. So, you know, this is an international economic session, so we already know that trade is a very important driver of growth. And the other motivation is uncertainty and expectations are important, and they are shaping the export behavior. And Türkiye, it's a dynamic, volatile, and strategic trade player, and still it's a small open economy. So, so what we do in this paper? Actually, this part is rather about our contribution, and I think it's important. So what we do is that we investigate how expectations and uncertainty affect Turkish exports, and we investigate this after controlling for the other factors. And we are focusing on asymmetric effects, and for this we use NARDL model, and our data set is unique, so I think that's the most important contribution that we have here. So I'll not go into the details of literature background. This trade and growth linkage is already obvious, and perhaps most of you have already read these papers. But this uncertainty part is, I think, important. This is coming from the theoretical papers, and they are saying that the uncertainty and expectations form the export, so they are important for the export behavior. And exchange rate volatility and export linkage, actually, this is still an unresolved issue, and even for Turkish economy, we have papers supporting the positive effect of volatility on exports, and some other papers supporting the opposite. So, our contributions. First of all, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first paper that is testing the impact of export expectations on exports. For this, we are using Ministry of Trade's expectation survey, and I'll talk about this. And we are using asymmetries both for trade expectation and exchange rate volatility. So why did we choose Türkiye? I mean, first of all, to be honest, we have the export expectation data, and this is like a unique data, which is not available in many of the countries. That's the first reason. And we have a rich quarterly data set, and we have quarterly data for the expectations as well. And of course, for this region, you know, Türkiye is like the first and biggest economy that has strong ties with EU, and it is somehow good, but at the same time it makes Türkiye vulnerable to external shocks, and of course we have a very volatile economy, but we are open to trade, and geopolitically we are exposed to many of the shocks as well. So our data, export volume, you know, is the standard data, but this export expectations survey. Now, what is this? This is an index that we are using, and this index formed by the ministry, and it is composed of the answers of the companies to the questions. What kind of questions? Like, what are your expectations for exports? What are your expectations for the orders that you can that come to your company? What are the expectations for sectoral exports? And what are the expectations for exports to different countries and unit price expectations? So these are all asked, and they are gathered together by the ministry, and they form the index. Actually, how much representative is, of course, the other question. You know, it's not easy to get replies and constantly replies to those surveys, but the good thing here is that, of course, this is a government institution doing this, so it increases the replies. At the moment, the survey represents more than 40% of the exports of Turkey.
Can I just ask a clarification question? What is the type of the question itself that is asked regarding expectations?
So I just explained, like, what is your expectation about the orders, for example, or what are you expecting for the sectoral exports? Increase, decrease, how much increase, how much decrease, etc.
Increase, decrease.
How much increase, how much decrease.
Okay.
So both intensive and extensive kinds of questions.
Is the audit response to the question, or
No, we don't see the detailed firm level response.
Oh, okay.
This is a macro paper, yeah. I know you're working firm level, but we don't have access to that. Okay. So what we are using is the NARDL model. So why do we do that? First of all, it captures short-run and long-run asymmetries, and we can decompose positive and negative changes, and for both expectations and volatility, it's important to see these asymmetric effects. And it is also suitable for small samples and mixed integration orders. So this is like the summary of our model. This is our period, and the variable is export volume is the dependent variable, and independent variables are export expectation, European GDP, like this is representing the foreign output or foreign demand for Turkey, and EU is like more than around 60% of our exports go to EU. And we have the real effective exchange rate data. This is from Central Bank of Turkey, and this is the effective exchange rate. And lastly, we have the euro exchange rate gauge volatility, and this is coming from the Bloomberg. So what we are doing is the asymmetric modeling. We are treating positive and negative expectations separately. We also look at real exchange rate asymmetric effects and nonlinear effects. And we also use seasonal dummies and COVID shocks as well. Now, I hope it's much better to see, is it? Okay. So what we have here is, this is the long-run effects, and these are the short-run effects. So the bold ones are the significant effects that we have. So this is the, in the long run, the leg of exports. This is the expectations, but negative expectations. The positives are not significant. And this is the real exchange rate. Again, negative of it affects, the positive doesn't work. And we have the volatility that's working negatively. And in the short run, again, we have this time EU GDP and expectations negatively as well, like it was in the long run. And we did the vol test to see if what we observe is significant or not. So what we did, expectations have an asymmetric effect on exports. Actually, this is rejected, and so they have an asymmetric effect. So real exchange rate have an asymmetric effect. European Union's GDP has a positive effect, and negative changes in export expectations decrease exports. So we can see the main results here. What we have in the long run is that, first of all, negative expectations significantly reduce exports. So the positives, the companies do not take a move, but if the expectation is negative, then they act and they do their best, like maybe reducing their production. Real exchange rate depreciation boosts exports. So this is what we have seen in like the last few years as well by observation. And volatility weakly dampens trade. So we don't have a very strong volatility effect in the long run. And past exports are affecting decreasing exports. So it means there's an inertia here. And in the short run, EU GDP has strong positive effect. This is like expected. And negative expectations are significant again. So it is very strong both in the short run and in the long run. And real exchange rate and volatility are less impactful in the short run compared to long run. And with the Volt test, we have confirmed the asymmetries in expectations and real exchange rate. And what we have seen is that long run and short run behaviors are different. And exports lengths and EU demand are statistically significant. And we did some robustness analysis. We did models with COVID dummies, and we tried alternative asymmetries. And at the end, our core findings are stable, and expectation effects are consistent as well. And what we conclude is that expectations and volatility shape export dynamics. So actually, we have found a link which was not tested before expectations, and we see that it is significant here. And policymakers must manage both signals and fundamentals. This is important. And any RDL model offers deep insight into these asymmetries. So stable trade policies is important. You should get rid of volatilities as a policymaker. And of course, central banks should be working here with the ministries of trade to keep the exchange rates stable. So exchange rate management is important. And they should provide targeted support and information to exporter about market condition. You know, we always talk about market intelligence. Actually, this expectation channel show the importance of market intelligence and how trade ministries should work to inform exporters better, because they really are affected negatively from the bad news. And this is all I have. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Nora.
Thank you very much, Nazire, for this very interesting presentation. I have a few comments because, to be honest, I'm not very familiar with your model. This is why I'll probably comment on more on other aspects of the paper. So the study, I find the study very interesting because it's very timely and it can be also framed much better, I think, in the ongoing uncertainties and turbulences and the geopolitical developments that are very rapid. So it's really very timely in terms of the actual context. You basically test the exports behavior in response to two types of global uncertainty and exchange rate fluctuations, and you also are able to distinguish between short-run and long-run effects. it's also very interesting because of the significance of Turkey as an actor in the global economy. While being an open economy, it's also exposed, of course, to global uncertainties and risks. It has a very important trade partner, which is the EU, and thus is also affected by what happens in the EU and policies that are implemented by the EU. At the same time, it has a long history, of course, of exchange rate depreciation and volatility. What really adds to the paper is that you use a unique set of data, which is the foreign trade expectations data, and this is a very strong addition, of course, to the literature. It would add a lot to the paper if you include a stylized facts section. I understand that the literature doesn't cover really the combination of uncertainties and exchange rate volatility, but you may want to invest first a bit more in the literature on exchange rate volatility and try to look at any papers on global uncertainty and your outcome that you measure, even if they do not adopt the same methodology as much as possible, and possibly also include a stylized facts section, because I had the same question as Chahir. What is actually this survey, and what are the questions, who are the respondents, how many firms said what exactly? We didn't know if you have access to the disaggregated data by firms, or if you have percentages, for example, of firms responding positively or negatively to something. Is it a quantitative index, and what does this index measure exactly? So the reader is really very interested and very curious to learn about what this index is and what are the results that you see. How has it evolved over time? For example, these expectations or the outcome of the survey. And also, what are the key questions that are asked? If they are too long, you can maybe, I don't know, aggregate them into categories and put them in an annex, but it's worth, because this is your contribution, and this is a unique data set, so it's worth explaining it and exposing it more in the paper. We could also learn more about Turkey's trade policies, exchange rate policies and exchange rate fluctuations over a period of time, in order also to have an idea about what's going on in these matters. How did the exports evolve? What are the trade agreements? Because these are variables that also explain your exports. And my last comments refer to my impression is that the paper was a bit isolated from the empirical literature. I'm not sure if there is a lot of if there is a significant body of literature using the same methodology that you've used. Maybe I guessed that there is not a lot out there about this, but it would be nice if you try to find papers working on maybe the same question in other countries, in other developing countries, and maybe try to compare the findings. Again, I'm not sure if there's something like that out there. If not, you could also explicitly mention that in the paper, that there is, to your knowledge or to the best of your knowledge, there isn't enough literature on developing countries, not only on Turkey, but on other developing countries as well, tackling the same question. And this would be, therefore, a huge addition to the literature. So your paper would really be a huge addition. And you could also invest a bit more in situating the paper in the timely context, in the current context of rising uncertainties, changes in trade policies, also changes in policies of the EU, because you mentioned that the EU exchange rate and the EU GDP have a short-term effect on the exports of Turkish firms. So you may also want to mention that this is the research question is critical for Turkey because of the rising uncertainties and the rising global uncertainties, in addition to the uncertainty at the EU level. So just to give it a bit more of a geopolitical flavor. Thank you very much, and I open the floor now for discussion. If anyone has any questions, I need to, please, you need to make sure that you speak in the mic because of the recording. So please ask for the mic.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation. Just, I will not comment, but I need information about your model, regression model. It's, because 2 weeks ago I ran a model, RDL, not NRRDL. I didn't know that. It's first time I heard about that. So it's, for me, it's something new, innovation. My computer, I use Stata software. I don't know if you use R or Stata. It spent 10 hours without reaching concavity. So I turned off the computer because I was worried about my computer. And which is the originality, I think, because the size of the sample, if it take accounts of it's large or small, so it will give you really efficient estimation. And is there any reference about that, or also for the variable expectation? It's a binary dichotomic variable. It's negative or and negative. There is no situation in between, like stagnation or something like that. Did you, for example, test for the worst and the best scenario and try to include it for the volatility, for example?
What do you mean by best and worst scenario? I didn't get it.
Instead of using expectation, just to build an indicator, to imagine, maybe through simulation or something like that, instead of relying to the survey or something like that, which is sometimes subjective, to make scenarios and to see the best and the worst and the neutral maybe scenario, something like that, through
I haven't
simulation.
seen any paper like that, so I'm not familiar with this type of modeling.
Yesterday, I attended the session about the Iranian embargo. It can create artificial.
But it's an embargo, so
yeah.
It's a shock. It's a given shock.
Yeah.
And you're trying to make the scenario of the shock, but in this kind of macro papers, I have never seen a version of it like this. I mean, we do not usually use this kind of scenarios if there is no predetermined external shock.
Okay, thank you.
But thank you very much for the
And
comments.
also we use EViews.
EViews?
Yes.
Oh, nice. Good news for me. I will
Yes.
do it.
And you don't need too large sample size.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
And maybe I can give a quick response to Nora. So this is a draft paper, and I already observed what you said is missing. We really need some more introduction to our expectation survey, so we will definitely do. Thank you very much. And I understand that I have to work a little bit more on the presentation of the literatures as it's a draft paper. Thank you very much for the comments. We will definitely check it out. So, Chahir.
Thank you, Nergiz. The paper is very interesting. I think the topic itself of uncertainty currently is both academically and from a policy-making perspective is very relevant. I have a few suggestions perhaps for the next revision of the paper. I was wondering to what extent most of the variables that you introduce are themselves determinants of the expectations, in the sense that if we have an exchange rate devaluation, for instance, in Turkey, or if they see that the GDP of Europe is increasing, then they expect that exports are going to increase. So this leads me to the suggestion that perhaps you might proceed in two stages, where you first examine the determinants of expectations themselves, and from this first stage you examine the impact of expectations on the export volume. This will have an econometric problem, in the sense that you will need to choose a selection variable that identifies expectation that does not affect the export volume, which might be a bit tricky. But I think if you manage to do so, it will be very interesting, because the first reaction was that the volatility, the exchange rate, the real effective exchange rate, all these variables themselves, they are determinants of the expectations. So
I got your point. Thank you.
Sorry?
I got your point.
yes, so that's the first point. The second one, I think it will be important also to include two variables: the GDP of Turkey, because you're including the GDP of Europe.
But is this an export model?
Yes, but it will measure the supply side, because you have the demand side, which is the EU, and having a measure also for, or at least the economic growth of Turkey, just to have a measure of the macro environment in general in Turkey, because in any export demand equation, you have a variable that measures the macro environment.
Not really, but okay.
Are you controlling for the war in Ukraine itself, given that you're extending the analysis until 2023 or not?
We are not controlling for that. I don't think we will be any effect of it, but we will check.
You might want to, yes.
Yeah, we will check for that.
And then two last comments. The first one, I think one of the important variables that you also want to introduce is the Trade Policy Uncertainty Index that was constructed by Caldara and his co-authors, and now it's really one of the Trade Policy Uncertainty Index of Caldara, CA.
Okay, I think it was in my reference.
Yes, but I mean, that index itself you can use actually. And finally,
Index for world or?
Trade Policy Uncertainty Index.
For the world.
Yes. And because this can also affect expectations. If globally we have uncertainty, then this will affect our own expectations in the model. And finally, would it be possible also to run some impulse response functions to see how a change in the expectations themselves can lead to a change, like it would be like the policy simulation part of the paper, to see how expectations, a change in expectations can affect the future developments of export volume. This might also add to the analysis just to see how the exports of Turkey will evolve in the future.
Okay, we will think of it.
Thank
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Any other final maybe question before we finish? Okay. Two more questions.
Just to give you just an information, when you have a model that is nonlinear, you might have the risk to have different values of the coefficient using different software. This is known. The researchers started to find this when they started to estimate Garch models. So, and they found that the persistent parameter range from 0.6 to 0.99. So using different software, you may have different parameter values if your model is nonlinear. So you have to, this is just information I want to share.
Actually, this model is not the really nonlinear model. It's nonlinear model because the positive and the negative effect. So,
so it's not nonlinear, and so just because
this is just yes. Because of that, positive and the negative effect both in the same model. So this is nonlinear.
I thought this is nonlinear or
yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
She has a question. Thank you.
I like the paper. It looks interesting, but I have some suggestions for data sets. I have worked on uncertainty a little bit, and there is Turkey Economic Uncertainty Index, and it's done for worldwide, each country on its own, and there is also the World Uncertainty Index. So there are so many indices going on, and it's nice to see how these different indices will affect your model.
Actually, the index that we are using is special for export expectations. So the others are for the general expectations, but this is specific to export expectations. Okay. And the data is collected from the Turkish exporters. Okay. So it makes it specific, you see.
Yeah. And it would be interesting to see the impulse response function to see how the change in the system of equation, how when you introduce one.
This is this single equation.
Okay.
So
I would suggest have Dr. Chahir suggested, it would be nice to have a system of equations to see how the different interactions. Yes.
In order to get
because you are doing time series, so
yes. But because we use asymmetric effect, so positive sign and the negative sign, so it's hard to run a VAR with this negative and the positive effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's not common to use that with those types of variables.
Maybe we can use a sign restriction VAR, but without asymmetric effect. But we...
That's the contribution
yes,
of the
that's the
paper.
contribution, asymmetric effect.
Actually, it was a very lively session. Thank you very much for all the comments. We will benefit from them all. And thank you very much, Nora.
Thank you, Nazire. Thank you very much for the very interesting 3 presentations and for the fruitful discussion. I close the session now and we can go to the coffee break. Thank you all.